if it wasn't Nusach, it wasn't Chazanut, it wasn't the prayer service, and he would never deteriorate from it. The beauty of what he brought to the world of Jewish music and synagogue music was that he was an innovator that believed that he could bring new sounds to the synagogue. However, they had to be embedded in Nusach HaTfilah. And that was the uniqueness of Leib Glantz. What the cantors today are doing is going away from the Nusach, bringing in foreign music in order to be popular in their congregations, which I respect. But
thinking about Balei Tefillah, Chazan, but in the good old days you would have a Bal Tefillah. A Bal Tefillah didn't necessarily have all the polish of a Chazan, but he knew the Nusach, and he knew all the twists and the turns. Like Shaul was mentioning to me, a certain Nusach, a Hungarian Nusach, for Shachris Rosh Hashanah, said, Perei kol chayo, v'yohoi fanuchero, liyom asam, v'shavachim yomerim. This, maybe a Bal Tefillah from Hungary would know it, and it was passed on from generation to generation, even without the sheet music.
Well, the advantage of those cantors of the golden era of Chazanut, they were born into families where the center of life in those towns and cities where they developed, the center of life was the synagogue. And they got their nusach from the family, from the synagogue, and it was natural for them, as was the same for those Balei Tefillah. However, when you grow up in countries like the United States, and you don't grow up into a family where the synagogue was full of nusach, and you start learning it later in life, it's not a natural thing. It's a learned thing that you have to adjust to. And unfortunately, the nusach doesn't mean the same thing for them. It's not something that is embedded in their being. In their being, yeah. So I have great respect for those cantors that understand nusach and don't need to resort to copying. He says what they really do is they listen to a recording and they copy it. And what I would like from today's cantor is that they wouldn't just copy, but they would give of their own. If I need to hear someone copying Kusevitsky or Rosenblatt or Glantz, why do I need them? Why don't I just listen to the recording of those greats? And that's fine. But if a cantor of today takes the lesson from those recordings and then gives it his own personality, his own voice, and makes it even better, that's what I'm looking for. And I think that my late father, who died way back in 1964, almost 56 years ago, I think he would have appreciated that also. I'll give you an example of myself. I never became a cantor. However, as a child, I studied at the religious school in Tel Aviv, Beit Sefer Bidu, and I was a member of the choir of the great cantor Ravitz, as well as my friend Benny Meisner and motzen. It was important because you grew up in this choir that sang on Sabbaths, and it was quite an experience.
And you talk about the coloratura. If you have the choir, then you could ride that beautiful
Look
nusach.
how many nice, wonderful cantors came out of that choir. So that's important. At the time, my father wrote an article that you can find in my book, The Man Who Spoke to God, which is about Leib Glantz, which he said that what Chazanut needs is bringing the education of Chazanut into the schools, into the children's schools.
He said that.
Primary and high school and junior high school, in order to give the kids a feeling of what cantorial is about.
And you're building an audience.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden the kids understand the chazanas. It gives them an outlet, right?
And he was writing this in the early 1960s, complaining that where is Chazanut going in the world? And that's the reason it's not going in the right direction, because we're not educating young people, young children, to appreciate Chazanut. There's a famous thing that my father once told a very known cantor who came to him for advice and wanted to know how to sing something that Glantz sang. And my father told him, do me a favor, don't be Leib Glantz the second. Be, I'm not going to mention the cantor's name, but a very famous cantor, Alav Shalom. He said, be you the first. Don't be someone the second. And that's really comes back to what I said about the copying issue. You can't make yourself an established, important person if all you know how to do is make yourself sound like other cantors. You have to distinguish yourself. And there are some wonderful cantors today in New York and in Israel that I've heard that have done that. They actually have a character of their own, and I enjoy their singing greatly.
You know, I've been grappling with this question about how to carve out a cantorial personality, something that I'm working on myself, as well as vocal technique. But carving out that personality is a challenge. Going back to like the fact that they're copycats, in a way they're relegated to doing that, because doing your own improvisation at this point will never match up, or almost never match up, to the carved, crafted recitatives that were worked out by these Kaminsky and Rappaport and Rosenblatt and all the great composers. So, you know, a regular guy who's coming up the ranks, he may not be able to come up with that kind of improvisation. So they're stuck.
You will find, even in Israel, that the synagogues are not full of people. And the people that are in the synagogues are also impatient. And they're not receptive to Chazanut as we knew it. I mean, compared to the 1950s, when my father spent his last 10 years in Israel, you had a synagogue full of Hasidim of Leib Glantz who came to hear him daven.
Were you there?
Of course I was there. And
How many years were you there with him? Yeah.
And there were at that time other cantors that had followers and people that were willing to come on Sabbath or on a holiday and hear 2 or 3 hours of Chazanut and davening. You're going to find a different Israel today in the 21st century. The synagogues are empty. I'm not talking about the ultra-religious, but there's no Chazanut in the ultra-religious anymore. So the synagogues want to, as similar to the United States, they want the prayer service to be short. And there's no synagogues, hardly, maybe one or two in Israel, that have full-time cantors. Even they don't daven every Sabbath, but maybe once a month. And he describes the slichot service that started at midnight and lasted for 3 hours. And there were 1,000 people inside the synagogue and another 4,000 people in the street outside the synagogue trying to hear with loudspeakers, and policemen mounted on horses, making sure that there weren't riots there, people trying to break into the synagogue. I mean, can you imagine that situation today in the world of Chazanut?
Was that with the 10 years when you were with your dad?
The first slichot that he describes was in 1954, when he first came to Israel from the United States. Not only that, it was broadcast live on Kol Yisrael, the Israeli broadcasting company, to the whole country. Imagine, this was live from 12 o'clock midnight till 3 in the morning, and hundreds of thousands listened to it. It was a major event. And by the way, even to this day, I'm talking 60 years after, every slichot, they rebroadcast that broadcast. It was done every year for the 10 years that my father lived in Israel and before he passed away in 1960.
איך נפתח פה, איך נפתח פה, איך נפתח פה לפניך דר מתוחים. באלף פנים נשפט שיחי. הלכנו אחרי מסעות שווא ומדוחים. והכשינו עורב ויעזנו מצחים. כמה יסרטנו על יצירים ושלוחים, לא יקשבנו למורים, ונשמע למוכיחים. ויעז וידעתה הנידחים. נשחטים ונדבכים, שורדנו מתי מיד, בין קצים גזורים, איננו חלל, למצב ומחדים. Ziehen
Let's talk about the Chazanut today and what I have been trying to do along with about 50 members of our International Advisory Board, among them famous rabbis, famous cantors, famous professors, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, important people who admire Leib Glantz as a cantor and as a musician and as a Zionist and as an intellectual. They decided that it's time to bring back to life the music of Leib Glantz. So what we did was we created an organization called the Night Holocaust Project, and we combined the music of Leib Glantz with the words of Elie Wiesel, who, as you know, is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate who just passed away 4 years ago. And he, among the 60 books that he wrote, the first book he wrote was a memoir called Night, which described his own experience as a 15-year-old who survived Auschwitz, lost his mother, his sister, his father, but survived and lived to tell the story of the terrible experience that he went through in the Auschwitz death camps. So what we did was we orchestrated the music, 17 pieces of music of Leib Glantz into a modern way of expressing it. Some of it was just orchestra, symphony orchestra. Some of it was just choir. Some of it was soloists with the orchestra and the choir. And it really gave an expression of the whole sphere of Leib Glantz's creation. And we combined that with a famous actor performing Elie Wiesel's Night, excerpts from Elie Wiesel's Night. And this has already been performed in 3 different countries, in Russia, in Lithuania, and in Germany, of all places. And we just had the last performance in January of 2020 before an audience of 3,600 people in the biggest auditorium in Germany. 95% of them non-Jewish people. And it really represented a victory for the Jewish people that they could bring the story of night to Germany in the 21st century with Jewish music of Leib Glantz. It's hard to describe, but at the end of this 2-hour concert, there was about 15 seconds of silence, and then this 3,600 person auditorium burst into a 15-minute standing ovation for the performers of this concert. It was really an exciting moment. So
Wow.
I would
That's a historic moment.
It's a historic moment. We plan to bring this concert to many different countries in the world. I know next year it's going to be in Latvia, in the city of Riga, in the Opera House there. And we're planning to do it at the Hichala Tarbut in Tel Aviv. We're negotiating with performing this concert in Japan with a choir that comes to Israel every 2 years and sings in Hebrew, a Japanese choir. We're negotiating to do it in London and in Manchester, and also there's a plan to take the concert to several different cities in Russia, the major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Voronezh, and other cities. So we would like to spread the music of Lev Glantz and the message that the Jewish people, in spite of what the world did to us in the Second World War, and in spite of the anti-Semitism that is happening in this world to this very day and getting even worse, this is a message to the world. And the message of the concert is a stand against hate. I was involved in back in the 1960s, after my father passed away. In Hebrew, it's called Zeharim. Lev Glantz Zeharim. Zeharim in Hebrew means glantz.
I've never seen that.
And this was done by many of the admirers who contributed to this book. And
So some musical examples and teaching Nusach and philosophy of Nusach.
well, it's a lot about Lev Glantz. A lot of people wrote. The second book was done in 2008. It's called The Man Who Spoke to God, which I mentioned before.
Careful.
And in this book, there are 2 CDs with Glantz's recordings, 30 of his most important recordings. The third is the Lev Glantz Project. The Lev Glantz Project has 3 CDs in which he performs 43 of his compositions, of which in this book we made new interpretations or new arrangements, musical arrangements of his compositions in order to make them available for today's cantors so that they can sing them without necessarily having to perform the sparkling virtuosos of cantors like Lev Glantz. So
they were adapted a little bit, and they made maybe a little simpler at times.
yeah.
And choral works, it combines recitatives and chorals.
There's several works, yeah. And
Do you have different transpositions in that book, like baritone and tenor, or those are available in different printing?
no, there's some that are in different keys.
2 keys.
Yeah. But the nice thing about the Lev Glantz project is that the Florida Atlantic University, in their Judaica Sound Archives, or what is today called Recorded Sound Archives, they made a website where the whole Leib Glantz project is online, free for anyone in the world to hook onto, and they can print out the music itself, and they can also hear not only the 3 CDs recordings of Leib Glantz's voice, but also a internet interpretation sound of the new adaptations, the new arrangements, so they can compare the two. So it's really an amazing project which the university took upon themselves, and it's free for any lover of Chazanut who wants to delve into the work of Leib Glantz.
I know on the FAU website, you just go to Sounds and Scores under the About tab, and it's brilliant. I didn't realize you could download the sheet music there.
Download and print it out. Night concert.
Yeah.
The night concert is with a symphony orchestra of 60 musicians.
60?
And the choir is between 100 to 200 voices. In each concert we have 3 solos. Two male soloists and 1 female soloist.
Mm-hmm.
In the first 3 concerts, Daniel Mutlu, Cantor from New York, did an unbelievable job. Singing Glantz. He sang some of Glantz's most famous pieces, and he did a fantastic job.
Great to
Kol
hear.
Adonai, Shema Yisrael, Birkat Kohanim, and he is one of the great cantors of our day, I can tell you that. And he has a voice unbelievable. You can imagine getting an orchestra coming from Russia and a choir coming from Lithuania and a different choir. These are combined choirs. And a choir coming from Moscow and choirs from Germany and soloists from Canada and the United States and Germany.
Yeah.
No.
So tell me a little bit more about before we finish, about your experiences in Israel with your dad. Just maybe some memories of, sitting in davening and looking up. Did he have a choir? How big was his choir? What was it
He
like?
had a choir.
Were you at the rehearsals?
Yeah.
Choir rehearsals?
Yeah. And he had 2 very good choir leaders. One was the first year, Goldhor was his name, and after that, for the next 9 years, Yoshua Zohar. And they were excellent. They adored him, and they followed his lead, and he conducted very good choirs.
Is that music written
that
down?
That was not easy singing for choirs. That was complicated, demanded a lot of rehearsal time, and my father was involved in all the rehearsals, of course.
Mm.
Yeah. You talk about what I remember. Well, Leib Glantz was a very famous name in Israel. Everyone knew Leib Glantz. I mean, I was the son of Leib Glantz. Everyone, oh, you're the son of Leib Glantz. So everyone knew the name. And he, as I told you, he was not only involved in the Chazanut aspect of life, but he was a Zionist leader, actually social Zionism, labor Zionism. And he, in his lifetime, was a representative. He participated in 11 World Zionist Congresses. First from Eastern Europe, then representing the United States, and his final 2 as representatives of Israel. So he was a major contributor to Zionist
Did he
leadership.
ever cross paths with Herzl?
No, Herzl was before.
Way before.
But he was connected with labor Zionism. Labor Zionism was David Ben-Gurion, Ben-Zvi, the president, Moshe Sharet, Golda Meir, those people. Those were his buddies. He was very, very close
Really?
to all of them. Oh, very close.
2 degrees of separation,
He was-
right?
he
Right
was-
into
he was-
the
he was
Golda
even-
Meir.
He was even offered to be the Minister of Education in Israel. He refused because he said, my mission in life is cantorial music, not politics. When my father left Eastern Europe, Kiev and Kishinev, he was involved in politics, in Zionism. And at that time, Kishinev, where it was #1, the biggest center in Europe of Chazanut, and some of the greatest cantors at the time, Berkovich.
What country is that?
Well, today it's Moldavia, but at the time it was Romania. But you know, we're talking 1920s. At that time, it's not like it is today. It's you know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other places. So he was the Romanian secret police were rounding up politicians. They were rounding up communists. They were rounding up Zionists and all. And he was advised, you better get out before they arrest you for being involved in politics. So he got under
The wire.
a train and held himself under the train for 2 hours until it crossed the border. And that's how he got out of Romania at the time, Kishinev. And he got to France and went to the United States. And he only went to the United States in order to make some recordings. And then he planned to go to Palestine. I'm talking 1926, August 1926. And that was his plan, to go and devote his
How
life.
old was he when he grabbed on the train?
He was 27, 28. He was born in 1898.
Did he tell you that story many times?
Everyone knows that story. And his friends knew that story. The point is, he came to the United States with the intention of going and fulfilling his life's dream of building Israel, like you're planning to do now. And then he was offered a job in New York, in one of the big synagogues in New York, and he was looking to come to Israel, and came to Israel in 1930. And if I'm not mistaken, the Rabbi Berlin, who Bar Ilan University is in his name today, and he was the chief rabbi in Palestine at the time, who was a good friend of Leib Glantz, my father. And he said to him, Leib, you can come to Israel, to Palestine, and any synagogue you want you can have. You can be the chief cantor. However, there's one condition. Here comes the politics. You have to change your affiliation political affiliation, join one of the religious parties in Israel. You have to leave Mapai. You have to leave Ben Gurion, Ben Tzvi, Sharet, Golda, all those people. My father was a man of principle. And he said, I will never desert my friends, my colleagues. This is what I devoted my life, my political life to, my ideological life to, and I will never. And that's the reason that he had to stay in America from 1926 till 1954. And what happened in Israel in 1954 was that even though all the synagogues in Israel, were in control of the religious parties in Israel, one synagogue, Tiferet Tzvi synagogue in Tel Aviv, there was a uprising, a coup d'etat, and the people that took over the presidency, the leadership of the synagogue, were members of one of the labor parties. And the first thing that they did, they sent a telegram to Los Angeles, where we live. My father was in Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. And it said, we'd like you to come and be the cantor, the chief cantor of Tiferet Tzvi Synagogue in Tel Aviv. Now I remember when they delivered the telegram, Western Union came and delivered the telegram. I opened the door and they gave me the telegram. And I ran and gave it to my parents, and they opened it, and the joy, the happiness.
Unbelievable.
At that moment, and within 2 weeks, my father was in Israel. Within 2 weeks, he resigned. He left the United States and came to Israel. And
I know you told me last time he wasn't so happy out in LA. They weren't interested in real chazonis and maybe limited.
It's not that he wasn't happy. He was happy, but this was the first time Sinai Temple was a conservative synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a whole different atmosphere than an Orthodox synagogue, which he was always used to officiating in. And it was more, it was a different atmosphere, and they couldn't grasp the deepness of the kind of prayer that he brought to the synagogue. Now, they loved him and appreciated him, but it was a time, he was not only a cantor, he was a composer, a creator of Jewish music. And this was a time when he had to adapt to the demands of that kind of congregation. And
so he was already in his full powers.
Yes, he was.
In terms of
and
creative.
He was not the kind of cantor that was doing bar mitzvah children and weddings and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
His life was devoted to his religious life was devoted to davening and creating Jewish music, composing Jewish music. He wasn't, there was no demand of him to do what today a lot of cantors are demanded of being educators and being involved in other things in the synagogue or in the temple other than just praying.
What other music did he listen to, if you don't mind me jumping in? Did he listen
Classical music. And
Bartok, Stravinsky?
Classical music in general and
Did he like
opera.
He liked opera?
He used to take me when I was in Israel. Remember, I got to Israel when I was 10 years old. So
That was
I
in
was
1954.
54.
In 54?
Yeah. And he lived, those were the last 10 years of his life. And he died at a young age, at 65 or so.
Oh.
And
wow.
He died suddenly, by the way.
That's very young.
He was giving a concert in Tel Aviv, in this hall, and all of a sudden he sat down and said, excuse me, I don't feel well, and slowly deteriorated, and evidently it was found, they took him to the hospital, and he had a stroke, and he died the next day. without waking up. And unfortunately,
65.
unfortunately, there was a lot more music that he could have brought to the world, a lot more educating of cantors that he could have brought, and a lot more thought that he could have written about and lectured about Judaism in general, about cantorial.
So that makes sense why you took the torch too.
Yes, it does. And I used to go with him to the Heichal Tarvut, the Man Auditorium, which is now called the Bronfman Auditorium in Tel Aviv,
Yeah.
where he sat in the 11th row, seat 13 of the Israel Philharmonic. So, he was a man of serious music.
Because I
He
know
was a great pianist, though.
Really?
Yeah, he got his musical education in the Kiev Music Conservatory, which was one of the 3 great conservatories in the world. One was Moscow, one was St. Petersburg, and one was Kiev.
Yeah.
And he studied under Reinhold Bier, one of the great musicians of Russia at that time. He was his favorite student. And he studied composition under him. And he studied to be a concert pianist.
Wow.
So
So did you remember them playing
What?
Schubert and Schumann and?
he was mostly playing his music.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't devoted in at that time when I grew up. Remember, I was born in 1945, and he was 47 years old when I was born.
So
So
he already had his
Yeah.
time with Mozart in his 20s and 30s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was 47 when you were born. Wow.
And so he was very much. Let me put it this way. What are the things that make a great musician? And I will add a great cantor. So one is your musical education. If you have a high university quality, conservatory musical education, obviously you're going to be a great musician if you're good. Number 2, what does a cantor do? His Hebrew, Leib Glantz's Hebrew, was unbelievable. And when I say unbelievable, the national poet of Israel, Chaim Nachman Bialik, declared that Leib Glantz's Hebrew is of a higher level than his own. Can
Really?
you imagine what a statement that
Bialik said that about Glantz?
Bialik said.
Unbelievable.
Bialik. Leib Glantz knew Hebrew deeply, like no one. And why is that important? Because if you are Leib Glantz composing Jewish liturgical music, Leib Glantz used music to musically interpret the prayers, the meanings of the prayers. If you know Hebrew and you listen to his davening and you connect between how he expresses the music and what the music means, what the words mean of the music, you will be amazed. So that's the second component. The third component is religiosity. Leib Glantz didn't have a beard, didn't have payas. Maybe when he was a child he did, I'm sure, because he grew up in a Hasidic family, a Talmud Hasidic family in Kiev. And his father and both grandfathers on both sides were cantors, so he grew up in that kind of atmosphere. But religiously, his religiosity was deeper than hardly anyone. He believed in God, he believed in Judaism. You know, there's a story that they tell about him, and friends of his, that um, his father went to the chief rabbi of Kiev when he was 6 years old and said, you might want to know about this kid. He's brilliant. So they said, well, what can he do? So the father said, well, he knows 600 pages of Talmud, of Gemara, by heart.
Your father?
My father, at 6.
Excuse me?
At 6. 600 pages. Listen. So they said, we don't believe this. So they brought him and they tested him. And they were blown away. He knew not only the Gemara itself, but he knew all the explanations, the Rashi and the this and the that. He could tell them everything. He knew it. He had a photographic memory, so he knew it all by heart. And he just blew them away. So that's the third element. There was no crying in Leib Glantz's singing. There was no krechting. There was no crying. Because that's what kills Chazanut. That's why, in my humble opinion, people don't want to hear Chazanut. Because they don't want to come and hear people crying. See, in Shema Yisrael, there's no crying. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Where's the crying? Birkat Kohanim, where's the crying? Aseh Shalom. Huh? Kol Adonai. You speak Hebrew?
A little bit.
You know the words? Kol Adonai Chotzev Lavot Esh. You know what that means?
What does that mean?
The voice of the Lord is like fire in the woods. There's no crying there. The voice of the Lord.
Yeah. And that also...
And that's the problem with people that don't know what they're singing and they're copying and they don't know what they're copying. And when Glantz came to Israel, he said, enough of the galut, enough of the Holocaust, enough of the crying. We are now a newborn country starting anew in Israel. And there's no more crying in Chazanut unless it's, obviously if you're singing for the dead, Yitkadal, Yitkadash, yeah, then, I can play you I think you have it on one of the records, Yitkadal, Yitkadash, a Yizkor that he did. There's no singing. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah. If you ever hear it, I think it's on one of those things. I'm going to give you the book.
I think I heard it.
Yeah.
Did he love any chazanim that were an example that he heard live?
His true friends were two. One was Ganchoff and one was Alter. Those were his true friends that really adored him.
So thank you so much for this amazing interview, and just great joy to bring this legacy to the next level, and for me to go to Eretz Yisrael and take your father's music with me.
Hey, you're following in his footsteps, going to Israel. And I wish you a lot of happiness and a lot of success in your new life.